Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Brooklyn Community Board 14 Transportation Committee meeting taking place virtually via WebEx on Wednesday, November 2nd at 6:33. My name is Ed Sen. I am the co-chair of this committee. I'm joined by Steve Cohen and Sean Campbell, the district manager for CB14. Thank you to DOT for conducting this evening's presentation. So on the agenda, first we have a presentation on the proposed BQE repairs and traffic detours from Tanvi Pandya, the executive director of BQE and Design and Build at NYC Department of Transportation. And Sean, if you could, I guess, allow our friends from DOT to share their presentation and they can take it away.
Will do. Tanvi, do I send that to you? Do make you the presenter?
Yes, please. All right. I will set it on presentation mode.
So while she's doing that, I can do the introductions. Sean, this is Jonine Kidder.
Always a pleasure to see you, Jonine.
Very nice to see you too, Sean, and thanks for having us tonight. I think it's important that we share this information and answer a lot of questions that I know people have. So as you said, with me tonight is Tanvi Pandya, Senior Director of our BQE and Design Build program. And from her team is Sally Stolberg. And I believe I saw Diana Soriano from the Borough Commissioner's Office is also with us. So that's the four of us, and we'll go through the presentation, and we're available for whatever Q&A is needed, when we're ready.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for adding us to the agenda so we could walk you through what's coming our way with this.
Tanvi, is it just me? I'm seeing something on the screen that says rearranging. Is that just my screen? Okay, it's gone. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So this is obviously not tied to the larger conversation that has recently started on the BQE. This is more specific to what we need to do to keep the structure in a state of good repair until we get the larger solution in play. So this is more focused on the near-term work that we need to do. And we want to walk you through why and the complexity of what we're trying to do so you can follow along on why we need to do the detours and how exactly those detours will work. And then we should have plenty of time for questions should you have some, which I imagine you will. So this is about the cantilever section. You're all pretty familiar with this area. The particular sections that we're talking about we'll get into in a moment, but just as a general overview, we want to make sure that everybody's aware that we are spending a lot of effort on staying on top of the structure. We're monitoring it very regularly. Typically, the state does an inspection every 2 years of all bridge structures with their consultants. In addition to that, we have our design team engineers walk the full site every quarter, collect any information that seems like there is something we need to monitor more closely. And we might run some tests, we might take some samples or do some analytical work. So that happens on a quarterly basis. We also have these accelerometers and certain other specialized instruments along the corridor on the cantilever, so that continuously feeds us information. And just to kind of clarify, like, these are not the kinds of things that when they ping, it's like, oh my God, everybody run away. It's more of like, hey, you had a band of where you expect the data to be is here. Today we got some data that seems here, or it's been trending a little bit this way. Let's find out why it's trending that way. And most of the time it turns out someone kicked the monitor, the battery died or something like that. But regardless, we collect the data and we make sure that as we are doing our prognostication of future and when do we need to address those conditions or so on, this data helps us with that analysis. The other thing we've done since 2019, we had sensors installed on the roadway so that we can tell when there are overweight vehicles and just how overweight are there. And to no one's surprise, there are quite a few overweight trucks on these roadways. So we've been collecting that data, which has also helped us, fine tune our analysis. But in addition to that, we did get the automated enforcement legislation passed at the end of last year, or signed by the governor at the end of last year. So we're in the midst of doing the installation now, so that in early 2023, we can start doing enforcement using the automated system, so that instead of PD having to pull trucks and weigh them, the system will automatically issue violations to the owners. So all of this data is going into our analytical model. So we basically have a digital twin. And so this data feeds into that tells us how the model is reacting and if there's any need for action. So this has been ongoing for many years, and that effort is how we identified some of these areas where we need to do the work. So two in particular are the Queens-bound deck sections at span 34 and at span 4. So roughly on the cross street, that would be near Clark Street, and at Grace Court. In addition, there's some substructure units that we also need to address. Those are, I'm going to go into that a little bit further. But that came out of this analysis that we have been doing. Just to also be clear, this is not about a safety concern. This is about us making sure that we stay ahead of any of the concerns that might come out. So to look at it from another angle, this would be two deck sections on the Queens-bound roadway at Clark Street and Grace Court. The other area that I was talking about is this Clark Street fan plant. So if you're driving along Furman Street, you might have noticed there are these gates on Furman Street, roughly at Clark Street. The TA has some facilities that is embedded within the structure. And so the only access to that area is through this section, this where the arrow is pointing, between the Queens-bound and Staten Island-bound roadway. So while there's work happening on the Queens-bound roadway and that roadway is closed, that's the time we can access down into this cavity that is between the two roadways and do the work that needs to be done. So there's a column that needs to be repaired and some of the walls. We've worked closely with the TA to make sure that none of their facilities are impacted. And there's no subway implications to this. This is just a matter of making sure we coordinate with them, since they have so much equipment in there. But this will happen parallel to the work that's happening to the deck. And then the other area that we would be doing work in is inside this Jaralman garage. So if you're at that end of Jaralman and you look to the side where there's this roll-up doors, you can go inside and you're underneath both roadways, and there's a structure in the back there that needs work. There's a crack that we would like to repair. There's some of these beams that have lost some sections, so we'd like to address those as well. This work can be done without any implications to the traffic, except for the hyper-local in this area as as the equipment goes in and out of the garage. So we won't spend too much time on that tonight, as just FYI. The bigger implication, obviously, is when we work on the deck. So just to kind of explain what it is that we're looking to do, because this is a cantilever, the concrete that gets deteriorated up top is a bigger concern than on a typical roadway where we can just patch it and it's not a big structural concern. Here, because of the way the structure is configured, this kind of loss of concrete, and then that leads to salt and other things intruding interior, we get rebar, or the steel member loses capacity with the corrosion. So what we're looking to do is remove that concrete in this green area, which is along the cantilever, right at the joints. So as you're driving along, you've probably seen mesh both overhead, along every joint, roughly at every 50 feet. So in those joint locations, this concrete needs to be replaced, add some new reinforcement to the area, and then put in new concrete. Because of the nature of this roadway, when we place this new concrete, we need to do it across all lanes at the same time. And then concrete needs a little bit of time to cure before we can put traffic back on it. So that's the reason why the traffic implications are bigger for doing this kind of work. So again, just to sort of explain it, so that was at the joint where we have to remove a lot more of the concrete. As we go a little bit further from the joint, it's less of the concrete that's being removed. So it's a little bit upper level of the concrete that gets removed and then replaced with some additional reinforcement. And while that's going on and that work is happening up top, workers will be able to go inside this area and do the repair work in this yellow highlighted section. So what that will mean is there's some prep work we have to do. So in order to remove the bad concrete for overnight time, which roughly right now you may be seeing some of the notifications that come out where we say one lane open from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. during the overnight hours. So this would be the same kind of setup where either the inside or the outside lane is closed, where the workers are working over the Staten Island bound roadway. Just for the safety of that Staten Island bound traffic, we may have to close that lane to some extent. But essentially, they would be removing the bad concrete during the overnight hours, put a plate back on, open it back up the following day, remove more of the bad concrete, and so on until they've removed all of the bad concrete and basically gotten ready for the first weekend, where we would then close all lanes on the Queensbound roadway. And because this whole section of the concrete needs to be poured, it needs support from underneath. So wet concrete cannot hold itself. So we need to support it from below. So Staten Island bound would only be one lane at that point. And so from 2 a.m. Saturday to 4 a.m. Monday, Queensbound roadway would be closed. The concrete would be poured. It would be cured for a few hours before we open it back up to traffic. The Staten Island bound would open as soon as we think the concrete has enough strength to sort of hold itself in place. And then both lanes could be opened down below. So then once that is done, this is the section that's closest to the joint. So roughly 2 feet on either side of the joints. And then as we get further away from the joint, this is perpendicular to the traffic that I'm talking about. So this is a band of 2 feet on either side of the joint, perpendicular to the traffic. As we get further out, we don't have to remove as much concrete. So that removal and replacement would be a little bit quicker to get through. But the same thing between that first weekend when they place the new concrete, then there will be a bunch of overnight work where they remove the bad concrete. And then there'll come a second weekend where Queensbound would be closed and we would place the new concrete in that strip. So there will be 2 weekends that are like that. Staten Island bound remains open for those follow-up weekends. So to sort of summarize, there would be prep work during overnight hours. Then there would be that first weekend where new concrete is placed closest to the joint, which requires a support structure from below. So that's where Staten Island bound would be down to 1 lane and Queens bound would be completely closed. Then there might be a few weeks where you might not see much activity. And I'll explain to you why that is. And then you would have, again, prep work to get ready for that second weekend. Then the second weekend, Queensbound would be closed. Staten Island bound is open. Again, continue with more prep work, and then a third weekend. The reason those 3 weekends would be you wouldn't see continuous activity is because those 3 weekends cannot be back to back. Our city is very, very busy. We have holidays, we have major events. So those 3 weekends will be spread out over the construction season, anytime between March and October end. So let's say the first weekend, and we've given blackout dates to the contractor already to avoid major holidays and events already. But so once the contractor is on board, they would say, okay, looking at our production rate, looking at the crew that we have working, we think the first weekend we can do this work is, I don't know, third weekend of May. So then prior to that third weekend, you will see a bunch of prep work happening during the overnight hours. Then that first weekend would happen. Now, if the next weekend is not till end of July, it might be a little bit of a lull in the roadway. You may not see a whole lot. And then the couple of weeks before that last weekend of July, you'd see a bunch of overnight activity to get ready for that second weekend, and then so on. So there would be overnight work for a week to 2 weeks prior to each of the weekend closures, then the weekend closure, then until that next weekend, which would fit in wherever after you take out all those blackout dates. Obviously, to make that work, we would need to make it so that we divert traffic regionally. So long before people get on the BQE, try to get them to use other options or not take use public transportation, don't use a car, and so on. But there will be some people who have to get around, and even if BQE often gets used as a local kind of connection within Brooklyn itself. So those folks still need to get around. So we would have TA agents at many, many intersections. And then, of course, there'll be signage, giving alerts in advance so people know to avoid it. And then Prospect Expressway would be set up in the HOV AM configuration to kind of encourage people to go into Lower Manhattan using the tunnel, so that they don't come down to Brooklyn Bridge to go into Lower Manhattan. And of course, this is being done with extensive multi-agency coordination. So we've met with New Jersey DOT, Turnpike Authority, Port Authority, TBTA, Connecticut DOT, Thruway, State DOT, and so on, to make sure that they're not doing something that's going to implicate on those weekends. And, we're obviously, to change that HOV configuration is something we're doing with MTA and State DOT. In addition to all those, of course, we have to work very closely with emergency response teams. So we've met with NYPD, FDNY multiple times. We are having conversations around where they should be stationed in advance of these weekends to make sure that they can get to where they need to for emergency services, talking to hospitals and whatnot. So our outreach is ongoing and continuing to make sure that we take all of the different needs into account and make sure we are keeping everybody informed. Certainly, as these dates come closer, there will be a massive press blitz and an outreach, and talking to freight industry and the Vazi and Google Maps and all of those to try to say, hey, don't divert traffic where it shouldn't go. Please use the official detour routes to route traffic. Obviously, some people know their way around, will use other things, but we'll try and keep people on the mapped detour routes, because that's where we will have better control over the traffic moving around and keep it moving. And then for those who are closer, there'll be noise and dust mitigation and so on. In order to make the local traffic flow where traffic has to get off the highway, we will also be looking at, some turn restrictions, some parking removal and so on. But that's closer to the section where the work is actually happening. So what that looks like to make the Staten Island detour happen, which will only be for the first weekend, it's closed. The on-ramp from Tillery, Sands, and Vine Street will be closed. And so those who are in that local area can go along Furman and get back onto BQE south of Atlantic. Those who are coming from Prospect would be going towards Hugh Carey Tunnel. There'll be some local changes, which I won't go too detailed into here right now. But the primary detour for those who would have taken the Tillery on-ramp to go on to Staten Island bound will be through Washington and 3rd Avenue. And for those who would have taken the Sand Street on-ramp to Staten Island bound, they will be routed through Flatbush and 4th Avenue. And then lastly, those who get off Brooklyn Bridge and typically take the Vine Street on-ramp onto BQE Staten Island bound, they will be routed down to Furman Street. And to make that routing work, we are going to make some adjustments at the Columbia Street. So these are the three mapped detour routes for that Staten Island bound traffic that's being diverted. And so, as I was saying, to make sure that all of this diverted traffic that ends up on Furman Street is able to get back onto Staten Island bound roadway in this area, we're going to do some pre-work to turn this into a 2-lane on-ramp. So just for this weekend, this will be modified so 2 lanes can get on and keep the traffic moving along Furman. Excuse me. So for that reason, Furman Street needs to have the capacity to have 2 lanes in one direction. So for this weekend, it'll be turned 2 lanes towards the southbound. And there will be some additional local changes. Ooh, sorry. So for the Queensbound direction, the on-ramp at 4th Avenue and excuse me, I'm going to mute myself for a second and get a cough syrup. Oh.
I'll just quickly fill in to say that the link to this project that was provided after the last presentation that was hosted by Assemblymember Carroll is in the chat, and it is on our website under projects.
Sorry about that. So the on-ramps in this area would be closed to prevent traffic from getting on. So those will need to be routed.
Getting Tanvi some water. I think she's done too many meetings today.
Yeah.
Just bear with us.
So that's how the traffic will be reduced in this area. Which will obviously lead to more traffic in the local section. So we're going to manage that by having TA agents and restricting certain turns and so on. Including like these left turns that tend to lock up the intersections. So the primary route for those who stayed on Queensbound roadway all the way to the end, the last exit that they have to get off will be at Atlantic, and they'll be routed through Borum and onto Tillery. The other way to avoid everybody flooding Atlantic and locking that up will be, you know, at 3rd Avenue, to stay on 3rd Avenue, use Flatbush and get back on further up. And lastly, those who are on Prospect, they can still get back on, but they would get off at Atlantic. So those who do not want to go to Hugh Carey but want to continue on to Queens, they'll be able to go around. So those will be the primary Queens-bound main detours. Now there will be a certain fraction of folks that were actually headed towards the airports. And so for those, especially if they are freight, they will, and coming from further south, they would be asked to use the Linden Boulevard detour. Now we've had some conversations specific to where this traffic is getting off at the BQE and what that intersection looks like. So I'll get into that in a moment. But these are the primary routes. Obviously, as all these people are coming into Manhattan using Manhattan Bridge more and less of Brooklyn Bridge, we want to make sure that Manhattan Bridge can process that information, that vehicle at the Manhattan side. So there'll be some modifications to traffic on that end as well, along with TA agents to keep that flow happening. So in terms of where we are in this conversation, we actually have put out the contract to bid. We have received some bids back, and we're in the process of bringing on a contractor. The first thing that the contractor will do when they come on board is to give us their schedule of work, which weekends they anticipate to work, which would be which we will find out early 2023. So by March of 2023, we will have the specific weekends identified, which we will share with you once we have those, so that people can plan well in advance around those weekends to the extent that's possible. And at that point, we can have further conversations if there's some specific weekend events that are happening that we need to take into account. We have our TMC center, which is where all the traffic management happens. So they're all kind of going to be monitoring that whole weekend, that first weekend when we do work. We'll also have some staff that will be at various intersections and sort of reporting back into the TMC if something's not working, so that we can real time address situations if something is just not functioning or something happened at some intersection and so on. And then if there are lessons learned from that first weekend that we need to bring into the second and third weekend, we certainly would do that. So the overnight closures would be somewhere between March and October of 2023. There would be, in chunks of 2 to 3 weeks at a clip, kind of spread out over that time, but not continuous throughout the whole time. And then the weekends would be the sort of the bookends of those overnight prep work. Derailment work obviously would happen concurrently. It's not really impacting BQE traffic. And as we get closer with the more tight schedule from the contractor, we'll be back to discuss that further. Before we go into Q&A, I did want to take a moment to talk about this one intersection because it has come up before. And I want to make sure that I do address it here, because it is a concern we heard from other community boards. So we want to just walk you through what we were thinking and what's the plan going forward. So, so this is here. We were going to have, the truck route as it's mapped is coming off at that at this intersection here, right? So the map roadway, this is a state highway, so that becomes automatically a freight route. So that's why we were having this as a map detour to keep the additional vehicles as, going the path that they would normally take. We've heard from communities around this block that this is a very difficult intersection, being a weekend, potentially, especially over the summer. A lot of activities around. So they recommend or feel that it makes more sense to have traffic go down McDonald and then turn there. So we're completely open to that concept. We are just reviewing it to make sure that all the turns and the bike lane that exists and everything can be accommodated there. But that's pretty much, something that we've heard from community and absorbed into the project at this point. So, if you have any thoughts around that, we're happy to take that into account. But, we just wanted to let you know that we have heard this from your neighbors and are taking that into account. So with that, I'm open to take questions.
Thank you for that presentation. Before we begin Q&A, I just want to acknowledge Joelle Dusleve from Councilmember Rita Joseph's office. So thank you for joining us tonight. So we'll take questions from community board members and then move on to members of the public. So I do see Liz's hand up. If you would just go ahead and unmute.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I also really appreciate your taking into account the feedback at the community meeting in September. I know that's a little bit outside of Community District 14's boundaries, but it's really good to see DOT doing that. I also just wanted to note that, the truck routes within our neighborhood that this is being routed on include Caton Avenue, which is very small and already is very difficult. for the amount of trucks that are on it. More than half of our district doesn't have access to a car. Of those, in general, 75% of people don't drive to work either. So it is, a significant portion of our district is walking, taking the bus, taking the subway, biking to get around. And these streets that, I hope that the early notification about the changes will help trucks reroute their times to times where it's like more appropriate and they can go the route that they want to go. But I'd really like to see DOT, do some more to protect people here. This comes at, this has been a common concern I hear from neighbors. I know like Caton and Coney Island Avenue, trucks are always blowing the LPI to make turns because they're too big to make those turns. And those trucks, they don't just stay on those streets. Sometimes they take other streets to be faster, like Parkside Avenue, where a 25-year-old mother died in the last month because a truck driver driving an illegal 53-foot truck killed her. And I'm just thinking about this presentation a lot. And I saw that at the beginning, DOT has been measuring the weight of trucks, but it's not just the weight that's really deadly, it's also the size. Over 55-foot trucks, which generally is the 53-foot truck, the back of them, I'm sorry, I'm not a truck expert. Those are really especially deadly to people because they don't maneuver well on these small streets, especially the small streets, that are truck routes in our district. And I was wondering if there's some, I guess in addition to, how can you make our truck routes safer, not just for these detours, but just generally, but how also can like DOT approach working on getting rid of, getting oversized trucks that pose an especial danger to people, out of our city, and using smaller, more appropriate trucks. I would love to see sidecars and rails and other sorts of safety measures too, but just, this is not just a problem that is going to happen when there's a little bit more truck traffic from this. This is a problem that plagues our neighborhood all the time. And like I said, it really just kind of comes home on being so close to this death of, again, a 25-year-old mother who was biking from a place we know doesn't have a good bike, there's not a good bike connection into the lane there. And just if the design in general could be better for everyone, it could be safer, not just through these detours, but overall. Thank you.
So that's kind of a two-part answer. As far as the trucks being illegal and being longer than what they're allowed to be in the city limits, we hear you. It's more an enforcement issue than something that we can do. But we are in communication with the Borough Commissioner's office, who tries to work with the precincts to try to make that work. One of the challenges is it takes us certain trained officers to be able to identify that. So it's not like a regular officer that's just walking the street that can catch that. There's like only specific people who know those kinds of things. So it probably limits the amount of enforcement that happens. But regardless, it's something that needs to be done. In terms of the overall thing with the traffic and how trucks are maneuvering and so on, we did just kick off this BQE visioning discussion, and part of that whole effort is to get these kinds of inputs, and there is a freight component to that as well, to figure out what are the best ways to address the freight concerns, not just for construction, but in the longer run, as the number of deliveries continue to grow. How do we manage that, and how do we make the streets safe? Sorry, 1 second. I would encourage you to join that vision effort and be an active participant, because that is exactly what that group is thinking about and trying to work through.
I will say, Temvi, Liz is actually someone who is involved. So I do want to
okay.
say thank you, Liz, for being involved.
That's in a different hat, though. This is my community board hat. That's a completely different.
But yeah, they've been very, very involved with DOT. So thank you.
I just wanted to add one point to that in terms of the statement of district needs that I know that the community board does, and putting this request into the expense budget. I know that PD has, shared with everyone involved that they obviously need the personnel and the training time to make those officers aware of how to do the enforcement out on local streets. And I strongly encourage you to use that process to make it a priority for the community with the expense and capital budget program.
Just a really quick follow up to that is just, it sounded like there was an and maybe I'm just misinterpreting. It sounded like there was an automatic just receipt of like the weight of trucks. Like, is there a reason we can't make an automatic record? You know, DOT can't work to make an automatic record of the trucks that are in, and you know, I understand you probably can't do enforcement without other things, but to just get a better sense of this so that we can, you know, I think having the data of how many trucks are, you know, far too large for this area would help, you know, make progress towards fixing that problem.
That's something we can take into account. Some of these sensors do, like these sensors do calculate sort of what's the length of the truck or the number of axles that just traveled over it. The specific legislation is tied to BQE. So there, you know, if we were going to do enforcement level, we would need legislation to be able to do that kind of work. But, you know, if we were looking at something that was simply collecting the data, certainly that's something we can take into account and figure out how to use that data to better identify the repeat offenders or whatever.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for that. Before we continue, I just want to acknowledge, well, I don't see council member, I'm sorry, Assembly Member Cunningham anymore. Is he still here? No. All right. We'll just go ahead and continue. Steve, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thanks for the presentation.
Oh, we lost you. We can't hear him.
Steve, if you want to just type up your question for me, and I'll ask later. We'll move on to Nina, another community board member.
Yes. So, thank you. My concerns are the same as Liz. We live in roughly the same neighborhood. I bicycle down Bedford Ave where it crosses Lenox and becomes Linden and so forth. And as is, I mean, there are just, you know, massive trucks there. And I think that something that DOT needs to look very, very seriously at is changing not just, you know, however streets are divided temporarily, but even permanently changing some of the signals. For instance, there are many streets that have no lead pedestrian interval, and these trucks go barreling through red lights. I understand they're big, they don't necessarily stop the same way as a car would, but I think that there needs to be a real effort to prioritize safety of people who are walking, people who are bicycling, even people who are in just regular normal cars, because as we know, any kind of a conflict with these huge trucks is likely to be deadly to anybody on the other end. And you know, so that's just my thing, is just to really look at these streets, to look at stopping all traffic, giving adequate time for traffic to stop, for people to cross, for traffic to, you know, non-truck traffic in particular to get through. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Sean, go ahead.
I want to thank you. I want to just quickly let the people meeting know, and I can provide a copy of it, that this board, along with I think 8 other Brooklyn boards, recently sent a letter to Chief Royster, who's the commanding officer of NYPD Transportation, requesting more enforcement on the 53-foot trucks, period, about trucks that are off truck routes, about trucks that are parking off of truck routes, because that means unless they dropped in from the sky, they got to that parking spot off a truck route. And we will keep everybody informed of any response to that. I believe there was supposed to be an operation near where the fatality is, but our point is that it needs to be all along the route, and it needs to be certainly operations off route, because that's where we're seeing so many of these trucks. And just to point out too, that the detour that DOT is reconsidering impacts 7 and 12, but it would still have the same implications for CD14. And the concerns about being between a school and a playground also exist along Caton Road between the Marlboro School and the parade ground. And also Caton, then I'll be quiet, I promise. The Caton Avenue on the truck route is a, shows as a local route, and Church Avenue as the third route, when we all know Caton is used as the through route, and Church Avenue as the local with the addition of the bus lanes. So I don't know if local routes versus through routes were taken into consideration as you designed these detours.
We did do a pretty extensive modeling and coordination with because we collect traffic data across the city all the time. So we have multiple sources of data, including as people travel, there's certain data collected by the phone, GPS, and so on. So we took all that into account, and the analytical model took that and came up with this route, fully understanding that any uptick in city streets is always problematic because most streets are fairly congested, which is why we are also on this particular intersection. We'll have TA agents as well, even though in terms of where the work is happening, it's sort of far flung. But we recognize that this is, adding to that intersection's issue. So we will have TA agents posted throughout the closure window. And again, on that larger conversation, of course, that is, some of the folks are posting here on the visioning discussions, and that's where that will have to move into a deeper discussion.
And Tanvi, if you're using GPS travel data, then you're just taking data from how streets are being used rather than how they were mapped or designed, right?
Well, no, that's just one source of data as far as the volume, right? As far as what the mapping is, we have access to all kinds of mapping that tells us what the designations are. We're working with our freight route, our freight group within DOT. So there's multiple sources of that information. And I see the question from Stevens, if it sort of is tied to the same thing. So I'll jump to that. And he's talking about the meeting we had in person that Assemblymember Carroll had. And I understand he expressed skepticism, but those are the numbers. There isn't updated numbers because those numbers were done based on the calculations that we ran. We have a very extensive traffic group. We have a very complex PQE traffic model that's been calibrated with real-time data to see if things are matching up. And, can't say why he doesn't believe us, but I understand the frustration with the number of trucks that are already there. So any uptick is not helpful. But this work needs to happen on BQE so that we don't have to kick trucks off of BQE altogether. So this is not something we're doing just as an experiment. It's really, we're trying to keep BQE functioning in the way it's meant to so that we don't have to put traffic on local streets. Unfortunately, if we don't repair bridges, it becomes problematic.
Moving along, person.
Did you say Florencia?
No, Corazon.
Sorry.
I thought John had his hand up before I did.
We are just going through community board members. Then we'll open it to the public.
Okay. Well, hi. Thank you, Sean, and for the people involved who sent that letter out, and for highlighting that not only are schools and other populations happening along where we live down here around Linden Boulevard and Caton Avenue and Flatbush. I just wanted to find out, is there like space for I guess revisiting that reroute or detour to try to mitigate the amount of like they just barrel down any which way that they want to go. And so just to even think that there's going to be people just being directed to come right on down, really concerns me. So is there is there opportunities for that area also being relooked at for, I mean, I don't even know how to address that, but is there space for to revisit that? And also I wanted to also just find out why concrete and not tar that they use on the cantilevers. I was curious about that.
Sure. So in terms of, what traffic is being diverted there, let's, just to be clear, it's not that we're closing Prospect Expressway and say everybody get off. This is specifically just going to be a suggested route. Hey, if you're headed towards the airports and you could have taken another route instead of going all the way up into the area of the construction where there's going to be a lot of different detour routes coming together. Consider taking Linden Boulevard and going down that way. So this is not all of traffic. This is only if people would have headed towards Van Wyck any case. So that's why it's a fraction of the traffic. The other people that are headed, continuing on to BQE, they'll stay on and they'll get off at Atlantic and they'll do the detour through the town. So that's why that number, the uptick that we're talking about compared to the regular weekends, we looked at who would normally be traveling on weekends that are headed towards Van Wyck. And those are the people that we looked at. And that's why that uptick is a small fraction. Again, recognizing that any addition is problematic, but that's why we have T agents for that weekend. And in terms of why we would do the repair with concrete versus tar, I assume you mean like asphalt, the blacktop that you normally see. To get structural strength, you need to use concrete. Asphalt or the tar has no structural capacity. So we need to gain a little bit more capacity back that we lost over the years with the deterioration of the structure. So that's why we need to use concrete. This whole structure is concrete, so that unfortunately makes the repairs much more complicated for us.
Thank you. And I just remembered one last thing. Is there going to be any, I guess, extra information on the environmental impact and the ways that you plan to mitigate it around the Flatbush, Caton, Linden Boulevard area? With noise, dust, and whatnot that might be with the uptick in traffic?
So for such short windows, we don't typically do a full environmental. This is considered a repair job, so to speak. So we wouldn't do a full-on environmental assessment. What we do need to make sure is that the safety and the traffic is managed through the area. Again, this is for 3 weekends out of a year that we're talking. So it's not a big uptick. It's not a sustained uptick. I recognize fully that nobody wants any traffic anywhere on their streets. I get that. But there's traffic exists and we need to repair the structure. So we're trying to spread it in such a way that it's limited and it's on, specific routes.
Thank you.
Florencia, did you have a comment or a question?
Oh, never mind. I was just going to ask about Highway 27, but it's fine. Just how long? It's fine.
All right, thank you. Any other community board members with questions or comments before we open it to the public? If not, John, go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, you're good. Thank you guys so much for the presentation tonight. It's really, really informative, and I can tell it's such a heavy lift. I wanted to ask, and maybe this has been covered in a different meeting, but and if it has, don't waste everybody's time, and I can just look at that. But is there any plan for overall driving or traffic mitigation? I briefly lived in LA when they closed the 405, and that was considered like an unmitigated disaster waiting to happen. And basically, political leaders, community leaders made a big push to say, hey, sorry, there's nothing we can do, just don't drive. And it basically completely worked. And there was like not the traffic Carmageddon that people thought was gonna happen. So this lift, I know, looks so heavy, and all the work you've done is really amazing. I was just wondering if that is sort of a public-facing message that you were considering, because it seems like that might help overall. But I'm sure you guys have thought about that. I just wanted to ask. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of those things that happens when it's a temporary time frame. Making that very obvious and saying, listen, this is one weekend, you really need to not come in this area or use another mode of transportation does help. And we will definitely do it as broadly as possible, using every means of trying to get that message out to as many people as possible. And especially knowing when those weekends are coming as early as possible so that people can actually plan around it is what we are aiming for. I know some people are asking on the text, like, what are the blackout dates and when are you going to tell us and all that? Well, we know the obvious blackout dates. It's not going to be Mother's Day weekend, as Jonine reminds us every year. It's not going to be on any long weekends. It's not going to be the marathon weekend or any of those kinds of major times. But then after that, it becomes a bit of a struggle, to be honest, because there's so many things that are constantly vying for windows. We even during doing regular work or maintenance on the bridges, it's tough for us to find a window that we can do work. So the specific weekends we'll identify as early as possible so that people can plan around it, get it out to as much of the freight industry and so on, and businesses so that they can, schedule delivery at other times to the extent feasible and try to reduce that burden of the traffic that's on the detour routes.
I guess this is a good spot for me too to make my pitch. I rely heavily, as Sean knows, on my district manager colleagues to provide us with civic lists, contact lists, key stakeholders in the community. We want to cast as wide a net as we can, as we try to do on all of our bridge projects. So it's a long time since I asked, I think, for a civic list from Board 14. So whoever you feel would benefit from this and can then reblast it to large groups of people, we'll be looking for that information. Our community liaison for the project, Anita Novolukar, is building out a huge network based upon groups, the religious groups, the VFWs, the Knights of Columbus, the social groups. We're also interested to hear from you, as we heard from the presentation we made recently with Community Board 7, for small business outreach, again, in any kind of unique language or cultural needs. One of the key things we got out of the meeting with Board 7 was a contact for the small business, primarily Chinese-speaking community up in 7th and 8th Avenue. If you have any special groups like that you think would be useful for us to consider doing outreach, we've got, I don't know, Tanvi, a dozen languages that we can convert information into for those who either aren't proficient in English or particularly business people who, again, might not understand the kinds of construction information we're trying to share in English. Feel free to reach out, Sean, and give me whatever you think is going to help this effort. So that's my pitch. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. So I happen to work for DCWP, and I'm glad to be here tonight. But have you reached out to your colleagues at SBS? I think they would probably also have a number of civic associations that would be helpful. And I'm happy to connect offline with my contacts at SBS as well.
Please, please go right ahead and do that. We do have SBS on our list for an upcoming presentation specifically with SBS and the small business community. We're also planning a major presentation to a very large freight industry that will also include all the permit services that permit and file permits for all the overdimensional people who do travel legally and get permits. We're meeting with that group. We've already met with New Jersey Turnpike Authority and Transcom and all of the transportation providers as far away as Connecticut and out in central Jersey. The goal with that group is to try to keep as many of those through trucks on the turnpike and out of the city completely. And we've had very good response and support from our transportation partners throughout Jersey and Connecticut.
Great. I'll get your contact info from Sean, and I'll connect you with who I know. I see that Sean has her hand up. Also, I want to acknowledge my colleague Steve. He has a follow-up question in the chat as well. Sean, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, and Jonine, of course, I'm happy to provide lists, and one of the things I appreciate about you is that you reach out for that. it's sort of also why I asked about the blackout dates. It wasn't to throw more at you, but just to make sure that anything not on the list that might be one of our communities, which by the way speaks about 30 different first languages, any of our cultural events don't conflict, or we can get a heads up to people about dates to avoid when they are putting their permits in for street closures and that sort of thing. And also just to acknowledge, identify holidays that sometimes have events in the street like bonfires that don't get permitted. So let's work together on those dates and make sure that we're avoiding any unforeseens. And then I just want to note, I appreciate that Diane Soriano has stood out with me in the rain last week or the week before, maybe it was, to look at the city bike racks that are on Caton Avenue and to indulge for, the second or third time my concern that those city bike racks back out into the street. And my request that they just be flipped so people can back out their bicycles onto the sidewalk. And especially, I don't want to take advantage of additional stresses in this community, but I do feel like this is good leverage for that to finally happen, so that people don't have to physically walk out onto streets where we're really trying to get more enforcement on trucks that are off route and 53-foot trucks. And the idea of angling them at a 45-degree angle and then instead of straight out just isn't sufficient. It's not going to solve the problem. It just makes it a little bit less of a problem. So I really, really want to push for a resolution that keeps those city bike users from having to step into truck traffic. Thanks.
I will definitely take that back, Sean. Thank you for that observation.
Thank you, Diana, for letting me go broken record on you all the time on it.
Thanks, Sean. Tanvi, do you see my colleague Steve's question, the follow-up in the chat?
Sure. I actually still have that up on the screen, so I can share it. So here's the numbers on the bottom right here. So typically during the peak hour, there's 168 trucks. The uptick would be 22 trucks. The daily average is 1,121 total. The uptick would be the 146 for the day. Hourly average is 46. The uptick would be 6 trucks. So this is based on past data that we've collected, where we can see where trucks are getting on and off, and which trucks we typically see go from that part of BQE towards Van or something, that would take them in this path. If they're not headed towards Van they will stay on and they do what they normally do. If they normally go to this neighborhood, obviously they would do that regardless of the closure. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Steve. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other additional questions from the public or other community board members? If not, I'd like to thank DOT for their time and spending this evening with us and sharing this information. Steve, yes, I see your hand.
Can you hear me now or still no?
No, we got you.
Okay. I guess the only other question I had coming out of the prior meeting, I know your colleague took down a lot of notes based on community feedback. I know you mentioned the consideration of driving down, of using the detour down McDonald as opposed to East Fifth. So I was just wondering if there was anything else, based on the notes and the confirmation that the comments would be brought back to DOT or other agencies in terms of if there's any other sorts of updates from the last meeting that we had.
Well, the specific actionable that was directly on this project effort was this change of the McDonald versus Fifth Street. So that we're already taking into account. A lot of the other comments we received were the larger conversation. So a lot of those are sort of being added into the mix of this visioning conversation and what do we do about longer term freight issues and longer term street issues. So she's basically still continuing to collect that. If there is ongoing thinking in certain areas, which I think was either 3rd Avenue or 4th Avenue, discussion is already ongoing, so then that would just be fed to that team. So there isn't a specific action back out of that. It's more that the feedback went to the people who might already be either working on it, or where this larger visioning discussion is going, it would feed that discussion.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
And just again, this is kind of an initial conversation. We do expect to be providing updates to all the community boards and all the elected officials in 2023. And we will have a series of again, updates when more definitions are clear about the who and the where and the when. And we will have, of course, a full-time outreach team, you know, for getting into this. And then on the weekends when the work is actually occurring, Tanvi and her team will obviously have round the clock coverage on the closures. And we've gotten commitments from PD that they will also have supervisory personnel out there to see if an agent needs to be moved from this intersection to that intersection. A lot of things will be able to be done in real time. We're also doing a series of meetings with our hospitals and first responders to be sure that they understand what's happening as well and how they need to get around to still provide the services that are essential in the community. And we're doing those series of meetings as well. So at some point, probably when we have a clearer schedule, what I am hoping to do is to go back again to the Brooklyn Borough Board and the Brooklyn Borough Cabinet. We did one initial conversation with them, I think in September. I wasn't here actually for that one, but we will be going back again to get our arms, or try to get our arms around the whole borough as much as we can, as soon as we have more details.
And Sean, I'm seeing your question in the chat. So if tonight's presentation deck is different from the one that was presented at the joint meeting, would you please send it to CB14 so we can update it on our website?
I can
Sally,
throw the link into the chat. Yeah, is that what you're just going to ask? Yep, I'll throw that into the chat right now. And it is only marginally different, if that helps at all.
Thank you, Sally.
Sure.
And we will keep updating that as any of these changes that you've asked us to take a look at. So that's the only thing I would ask as you share it with folks, is to be clear, this is the information and what we know today. There will be additions going on as we take a closer look at some of these traffic requests and as we look at schedule. So the the information included in this will evolve and change. It's kind of a dynamic document. And to just please be sure people understand that when they look at this, that this is something that is going to grow and evolve.
Any additional questions or comments for DOT?
I only have one other little commercial that I'll take advantage of for one of my favorite community boards. We will be finally removing the 17th Avenue pedestrian bridge down off the Verrazano, the one that gets hit about 15 to 18 times a year. We're finally able to remove that bridge. The 27th Avenue bridge is currently under construction. 17th Avenue bridge is going to come down on the weekend of November 12th and 13th. And Sean, if you think that information is useful to your board, we can send you some information on that. I know Board 14 always asks me about bridges on the Belt Parkway. I'm very happy to finally say we're getting rid of that poor thing.
Great,
Okey-doke.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
And Sean, I don't believe there's any other items on the agenda this evening, so we will conclude this evening's Transportation Committee meeting at 7:36. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you too. Well done. Thanks.
Good evening. Very informative.
Nice.
Thank you.
I like it.